Hey everyone, Nate Klemp here. Today I want to talk about the application of mindfulness to tinnitus, or ringing in the ear. And we're going to talk about several non-mindfulness related tools that can be really powerful tinnitus, but also, more importantly, how we apply the various skills and tools of mindfulness to the experience of tinnitus, which for many people, myself included, can be quite destabilizing. So first, I just want to give you a little background about my history with tinnitus, which goes way back. I have been experiencing ringing in my left ear primarily for about 15 years, although I've also had what's called pulsatile tinnitus in my right ear at one point, which has mostly gone away. So I have been dealing with this for most of my adult life. And as a result, I've learned all sorts of tools and tricks and explored the research pretty extensively. So I consider myself a kind of informal expert when it comes to tinnitus. All right, so you've got ringing in your ear, you've got tinnitus. What do you do? Well, first, there are a couple non-mindfulness related tools that can be quite powerful to start with. One is masking. So if you are just experiencing tinnitus for the first time, you may not be familiar with this term. Masking basically means putting on some other ambient noise in the background so that you don't hear the sound of your own tinnitus. So you can use a white noise machine that sort of matches the sound of your tinnitus. You can even use some soft music in the background. This can be helpful at first, just for sort of bringing your attention to the things that are important to you, to your work. But as you sort of go on in your journey of tinnitus, you want to see if you can wean off the masking and go toward what we're going to call habituation. We'll talk more about that in a second. Okay, so masking number one. The second tip that you might consider is looking at diet. So it turns out, and this is one of the big discoveries for me in my tinnitus journey, that our blood sugar levels have quite a bit to do with tinnitus for at least some people. So the ear is not very good at regulating its own glucose levels. In fact, its levels of glucose sort of go with whatever's happening in the rest of the body. That means that if your blood sugar is spiking, your insulin levels are rising very quickly when you eat, these fluctuations can actually influence tinnitus. And so one of the things you can consider is changing your diet, eating fewer carbs, going to more of a low glycemic diet, almost like a keto diet. That can be helpful, but also exercise can be really powerful for lowering blood sugar. Okay, so those are all the things you can consider that are not mindfulness. What are the mindfulness-based tools you might use for tinnitus? And here I have to give credit to a man named Bruce Hubbard, who's a psychologist in New York City. Bruce has tinnitus himself, and one of the things he points out that is extremely helpful and was sort of a game changer for me in my own tinnitus journey is that the only known cure for tinnitus is mindfulness or cognitive behavioral therapy. Put differently, there's all these supplements and products out there. None of those have been scientifically proven to work. What has been proven to work is changing our mental relationship to the sound of our own tinnitus. And how does that happen? Well, it all comes down to a process that's called habituation. So it turns out that the human brain is wired to, over time, habituate to sounds in the background. If you have ever lived in a big city, for example, you have noticed probably that the sounds of sirens and car horns and things like that at a certain point just sort of fade into the background, even though at the beginning they might be quite upsetting to you. So the same is true of tinnitus. And there's actually a really powerful statistic here that after about 6 months to a year, most people who experience some sort of tinnitus or the sound of ringing in their ears, about 92% will habituate to that sound. So it can be very powerful just to realize that your brain wants to habituate, it will most likely habituate, and we're using mindfulness in a way to just help our brain habituate and sort of mitigate some of the bad habits that arise. And really the worst habit that arises in the mind is resistance. this feeling of trying to get rid of the sound, or this wave of thoughts that happens when you hear the sound of your tinnitus, all the negative thinking, the worst case scenarios. And here the internet, by the way, is not very helpful, because you'll read about people who may have committed suicide because of their tinnitus, or how it can get so bad that you can't leave your house. All of these things are things you want to watch out for, and you want to shift to that more optimistic view of, hey, I can habituate to this. So one of the things you can do is just remind yourself, 92% of people habituate to tinnitus. That's thing one. The other thing that can be really powerful is some people find that when they go into that negative mental spiral around their tinnitus, if they carry around with them a card, maybe a 3x5 card that has a message each time you experience tinnitus and you feel that destabilized state, that says something like, it's just tinnitus, there's nothing wrong, 92% of people habituate to this sound. So that's an example of a message. You might write your own message. It's kind of like a message to yourself that's just a reminder, hey, this will pass. I'm going to get through this. I'm going to habituate to this. And that will help bring your thinking back on track. The final tip for how we can integrate mindfulness into our journey toward healing the sound of tinnitus is to approach rather than withdraw when we hear the sound. And this is probably the most difficult thing to do, especially if you're new to hearing tinnitus. But the basic idea is that, we want to stop using the masking. We want to stop trying to run away from the sound at a certain point. And in a calm and relaxed state, just see if we can sit with the bare sound of our own tinnitus. So one of the ways you can do this is through meditation practice. You can actually find a quiet spot in your house where you'll hear the sound of your ear ringing, and use as your object of concentration, not the breath, not the sensations in the body, but the sound of your own tinnitus. And I know that sounds crazy, but if you're able to relax and simply witness the sound of your own tinnitus for 10 minutes or 20 minutes, a really powerful transformation begins to take place. That sound of your tinnitus starts to change, and you start to become more sort of accustomed to the sound. At some points, you might even start to see the sound differently. You might even hear the sound of God in your ear, right? You start to just change your whole mental perception of that sound of tinnitus. So if that's something that you're interested in, I'm going to be filming another video, and I'll link to this at the end, which is really a guided practice for tinnitus, for bringing you into that sound. But anyway, I hope that these tips are helpful. I know from my own personal experience, tinnitus can be really scary and really challenging on all sorts of levels. So my hope is that these tools and tips will help you, if you or somebody you love is dealing with this condition, help you get to that point where you've just habituated to the sound, or maybe through some of the other interventions, minimize the amount of that sound that you hear. I would encourage you to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell. I put out weekly meditations and videos, not just on tinnitus, but on all sorts of different applications of mindfulness to everyday life. Hope to see you soon.